The birth of Soviet armor, 1919-35s. Learning war the hard way, when the smoke of the First World War finally cleared, Russia stood transformed. The old empire was gone. In its place rose a revolutionary state, the Soviet Union, surrounded by enemies, scarred by civil war, and desperately behind in modern warfare. The Red Army had learned a brutal lesson during the Russian Civil War. Courage alone could not stop machine guns, artillery, or armored trains. If the Soviet Union was to survive, it needed steel-rolling armored steel. In the early 1920s, Soviet engineers faced an impossible task. The country lacked experience, factories, and modern designs. What they did have was time, determination, and a growing fear of future wars. Western powers were advancing rapidly, and the next conflict would be decided by engines, armor, and firepower. The tanks of this era were not masterpieces. Many were crude. Some were failures, but each one represented a step forward. Lessons learned in metal and rivets. From the humble MS-1 to the fast-moving BT series, these early tanks laid the foundation for what would later become the most mass-produced and battle-tested armored force in human history. This is where Soviet armor was born. MS-1 T-14, the first Soviet tank, the MS-1, later known as the T-14, holds a unique place in history as the first tank designed and built entirely by the Soviet Union. Introduced in 1927, it was heavily inspired by the French Renault FT, a tank the Soviets encountered during the Russian Civil War. At the time, the Red Army had almost no armored doctrine. The MS-1 was not meant to dominate battlefields. It was meant to teach. It trained engineers how to design tanks, factories how to build them, and crews how to operate armored vehicles. The T-14 was lightly armored, with protection barely capable of stopping rifle fire. Its main armament was a 37mm gun, later replaced by a 45mm weapon in upgraded versions. By Western standards, it was already obsolete by the early 1930s. Yet its importance goes beyond specifications. When World War II erupted in 1941, many MS-1s were still in service, used not as frontline tanks, but as static defensive bunkers, dug into the ground around Moscow and Leningrad. Their turrets became fixed gun positions during the desperate early days of the German invasion. This was symbolic of Soviet doctrine. No matter how outdated the equipment, it would be used. The MS-1 did not win battles, but it taught the Soviet Union how to build tanks. Without it, there would be no T-34. T-12 City A, Lesson in Failure. The T-12 was one of the Soviet Union's earliest attempts to design a medium tank, and it quickly became a harsh lesson in industrial reality. Designed in the late 1920s, the T-12 was ambitious. It featured thicker armor, a more powerful gun, and a fully rotating turret, features the Red Army desperately wanted. On paper, it looked promising. In practice, it was a disaster. The Soviet industrial base simply wasn't ready. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, and manufacturing tolerances were wildly inconsistent. The tank was unreliable, slow, and difficult to maintain. Only a handful of T-12s were ever produced, and none saw combat during World War II, but failure was not wasted. The problems encountered with the T-12 forced Soviet engineers to rethink their approach. They learned that complex designs required reliable engines, better metallurgy, and mass production discipline. These lessons directly influenced later designs like the T-24 and eventually the legendary T-34. The T-12 was not a weapon. It was a warning that ambition must match industrial capability. 24th I, the forgotten medium tank, the T-24, was the direct successor to the T-12 and represented a serious attempt to correct its mistakes. Developed in the early 1930s, it was intended to be the Red Army's first true medium tank. It featured improved armor, better armament, and a more refined layout. Compared to earlier designs, the T-24 looked modern, at least by early 1930s standards. However, the problems persisted. The Soviet Union still lacked reliable engines and precision manufacturing. Mechanical failures were common, and production was slow and expensive. Only around 24 T-24s were ever completed. By the time Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the T-24 was already obsolete. Most had been withdrawn from service long before the war began. Yet its influence was profound. The 24 forced Soviet planners to abandon complicated, low-production tanks in favor of simpler, more rugged designs that could be built by the thousands. In that sense, the T-24 helped shape Soviet philosophy, quantity, reliability, and battlefield survivability over perfection. A philosophy that would define World War II. 26 Terrify, the workhorse of the Red Army. If the MS-1 taught the Soviets how to build tanks, the T-26 taught them how to fight with them. Based on the British Vickers 6-ton tank, the T-26 entered service in the early 1930s and quickly became the backbone of the Red Army. Thousands were produced, making it one of the most common tanks in the world before World War II. The T-26 was slow and lightly armored, but it carried a powerful 45mm gun capable of destroying most early German tanks. During the opening phase of World War II, the T-26 formed the bulk of Soviet armored forces. It fought in Poland, Finland, and during the catastrophic opening months of Operation Barbarossa. Against German Panzer thrusts and IVs, the T-26 was outmatched, not because of firepower, but because of poor armor, lack of radios, and outdated tactics. By late 1941, losses were staggering. Still, the T-26 bought time. It slowed the German advance and absorbed blows while newer designs were rushed into production. It was obsolete, but it stood its ground. BT-2, speed becomes a weapon. The BT, the 2nd of March, led a radical shift in Soviet tank design. Inspired by American engineer J. Walter Christie, it introduced high-speed maneuver warfare to the Red Army. Entering service in 1932, the BT-2 was fast, extremely fast for its time. On roads, it could reach speeds over 40 miles per hour, something unheard of in the early 1930s. The idea was simple. Speed would compensate for weak armor. During World War II, BT tanks were still in service, especially during the early battles of 1941. They were fast enough to surprise German units, but dangerously vulnerable to anti-tank guns. The BT series exposed a brutal truth: speed without protection was not enough. However, the BT-2's greatest legacy was what came next. Its suspension system and mobility concepts directly evolved into the T-34, combining speed, armor, and firepower into one revolutionary design. The BT-2 ran so the T-34 could fight and win. Speed vs firepower, the BT and early T-series. 1935-1940 fast tanks for a fast war. BT-5 T-57 speed over protection. The BT-5 entered service in the mid-1930s as part of the Soviet Union's push for fast, mobile warfare. Built on Christie suspension, it was designed to outrun enemy forces rather than absorb fire. With a 45mm gun, the BT-5 had respectable firepower for its time, capable of destroying early German tanks. During the opening phase of World War II in 1941, BT-5 tanks were still in frontline service. Their speed allowed rapid movement and counterattacks, but their thin armor made them extremely vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. Many were destroyed within the first months of Operation Barbarossa. The BT-5 demonstrated a key lesson. Speed alone could not survive modern war. That lesson would directly influence the design of the T-34 BT-7 final evolution of the BT line. The BT-7 was the most advanced version of the BT series and one of the fastest tanks in the world before World War II. Introduced in 1937, it featured improved armor, better reliability, and the same powerful 45mm gun. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, hundreds of BT-7s were deployed along the western borders. In the early battles of 1941, they achieved limited success through surprise and mobility. However, German air superiority, poor Soviet coordination, and weak armor led to devastating losses. Despite its failures, the BT-7 played a critical role in Soviet tank evolution. Its suspension and mobility systems became the foundation for the T-34, transforming speed into a balanced battlefield advantage. 28 Terrify, a multi-turreted experiment. The T-28 was a Soviet attempt to create a breakthrough tank capable of smashing fortified defenses. Entering service in the mid-1930s, it featured multiple turrets and a large main gun, reflecting pre-war ideas about tank combat. During World War II, 28 tanks saw action primarily in the Winter War against Finland and during the early stages of the German invasion. Against poorly equipped forces, the T-28 could be effective. But in modern combat, its large size, thin armor, and mechanical complexity made it an easy target. The T-28 proved that bigger was not always better. Its failure pushed Soviet designers towards simpler, single-turret designs better suited for mass production and combat survival. T-2050Ts and a giant that couldn't survive. The T-35 was one of the most visually impressive tanks ever built, a massive 5-turreted land battleship designed to intimidate and overwhelm enemies. Introduced in the mid-1930s, it symbolized Soviet ambition rather than practicality. When World War II began, T-35s were deployed during the German invasion in 1941. Most were lost not to enemy fire, but to mechanical breakdowns and air attacks. Their enormous size made them slow, unreliable, and easy to spot. The destruction of the T-35 marked the end of the multi-turret concept. It was a clear example of how pre-war theory collapsed under the reality of modern mechanized warfare. 37A Phoebe, the amphibious scout. The T-37A was a light amphibious tank designed for reconnaissance and river crossings. Entering service in the mid-1930s, it could swim across rivers without bridges, giving the Red Army unique mobility options. During World War II, the T-37A was used primarily in reconnaissance and support roles. Its light armor offered almost no protection, and it was highly vulnerable to small arms and artillery fire. Many were lost during the chaotic early battles of 1941. Despite its weaknesses, the T-37A influenced later amphibious designs. It highlighted the Soviet emphasis on mobility, flexibility, and operating across difficult terrain, key elements of Soviet armored doctrine. World War II, the Steel-Tide 1941-1943. The tank that saved Moscow T-34, 76 millimeters, the tank that changed the war. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Red Army was caught off guard. But one tank shocked the Wehrmacht, the T-34, armed with a 76 millimeters gun, sloped armor, and wide tracks. The T-34 was unlike anything German forces had encountered. Its sloped armor dramatically increased protection without adding weight, while its mobility allowed it to operate in mud, snow, and broken terrain. During the Battle of Moscow, T-34S played a decisive role, counterattacking German spearheads and buying critical time. Early production suffered from poor optics and crew training, but the tank's raw combat performance proved decisive. From 1941 to 1943, the T-34 became the backbone of Soviet armored forces and forced Germany to redesign its own tanks. The T-34 didn't just fight the war, it reshaped it. KV-1 Fun, the tank that wouldn't die the KV. One was a nightmare for German tank crews in 1941. With armor so thick that early German anti-tank guns could barely penetrate it, the KV-1 was almost unstoppable in the opening months of the war. Armed with a 76 millimeters gun, the KV-1 could destroy any German tank it encountered at the time. During battles in 1941, isolated KV-1S held off entire German units, absorbing dozens of hits without being destroyed. However, heavy armor came at a cost. The KV-1 was slow, mechanically unreliable, and difficult to repair in the field. As German weapons improved, its advantage faded still. From 1941 to 1942, the KV-1 provided the Red Army with a psychological and tactical edge when it was needed most. KV-2 Fu, a hammer, built for fortresses, the KV-2 was one of the most intimidating tanks of World War II. Mounted with a massive 152 mm howitzer in a towering turret, it was designed to destroy bunkers and fortified positions. In 1941, the KV-2 shocked German forces. Its armor made it nearly immune to standard anti-tank weapons, and a single shell could obliterate enemy positions. However, the tank's enormous turret made it slow, unstable, and vulnerable to mechanical failure. During the early months of the invasion, many KV-2S were abandoned due to breakdowns or lack of fuel rather than enemy fire. The KV-2 proved that overwhelming firepower alone was not enough. It was powerful, but impractical for fast-moving modern warfare. T-60 the emergency tank, the T-60 was born out of desperation. As German forces advanced in 1941, the Soviet Union needed tanks fast. Factories were evacuated, supply lines were broken, and production had to continue at any cost. The T-60 was lightly armored and armed with a 20 mm autocannon. making it ineffective against most German tanks. However, it was easy to build, reliable, and could be produced in large numbers. During 1941 and 1942, T-60s were used for reconnaissance, infantry support, and flank protection. While not designed for tank combat, they filled a critical gap until more capable tanks could reach the front. The T-60 wasn't powerful, but it kept the Red Army fighting when survival was on the line. T-70, the light tank that replaced the T-60. The T-70 was an improved successor to the T-60, featuring better armor and a 45mm gun capable of engaging enemy armor. Introduced in 1942, it became the primary Soviet light tank during the middle years of the war. T-70s fought extensively in 1942 and 1943, including at the Battle of Kursk. They were used for reconnaissance, infantry support, and exploiting breakthroughs created by heavier tanks. However, the two-man crew placed enormous strain on the commander, limiting combat effectiveness. As the war progressed, the Red Army shifted away from light tanks altogether. The T-70 marked the end of an era. Light tanks were no longer enough for modern armored warfare. Turning the tide, heavy steel and bigger guns, 1943-1945 breaking the Wehrmacht from Kursk to Berlin T-34 to 85 Find. The perfected legend introduced in 1944, the T-34. 85 was the final evolution of the most important tank of World War II, armed with an 85mm gun. It could finally engage German Panthers and Tigers on equal terms. A new three-man turret improved crew coordination and combat efficiency. From Kursk to Berlin, the T-34, 85 formed the backbone of Soviet armored forces. Reliable, mobile, and easy to mass produce. It overwhelmed German defenses through numbers and relentless pressure. The T-34, 85 didn't replace the original, it perfected it. IS-1 though in the first Stalin tank. The IS, the 1st of March, had the beginning of a new generation of Soviet heavy tanks. Entering service in late 1943, it was designed to replace the aging KV series and counter Germany's heavy armor. Armed with an 85mm gun and protected by thick sloped armor, the IS-1 offered improved mobility and survivability. However, it was produced in limited numbers and quickly overshadowed by its successor. The IS-1 served mainly as a transitional design, but it proved the Soviet heavy tank concept was evolving fast. IS-2, the breakthrough hammer. The IS-2 was one of the most powerful tanks of World War II, armed with a massive 122mm gun. It was designed to destroy German heavy tanks and fortified positions. Entering combat in 1944, IS-2 units spearheaded assaults against heavily defended German lines. Its armor could withstand most enemy fire, while a single hit from its main gun could destroy any German tank. Though slow to reload, the IS-2 was devastating in close combat. From Poland to Berlin, the IS-2 broke open the road to victory. IS-3CA tank, too late for the war. The IS-3 arrived at the very end of World War II and saw little to no combat. Featuring a revolutionary pike, nose hull, and heavily sloped armor, it represented a dramatic leap in tank design. Although it missed the fighting, the IS-3 made a powerful statement during the 1945 Berlin Victory Parade. Its appearance shocked Western observers and signaled the arrival of a new era of Soviet armored power. The IS-3 didn't fight the war, but it shaped the post-war battlefield. Su-85 Dison, Su-100 Fenting killers of the Red Army, the Su-85 and Su-100, were Soviet tank destroyers built on the T-34 chassis. Designed to counter German heavy tanks, they sacrificed turrets for powerful, fixed guns. The Su-85 entered service in 1943, followed by the more lethal Su-100 with its 100mm gun in 1944. These vehicles proved highly effective in ambush roles, destroying Panthers and Tigers at long range. Simple, reliable, and deadly, they gave Soviet forces a critical edge in late war tank combat. Cold War begins. Quantity becomes strategy. 1946, 1960, facing NATO with numbers T-40-45. The bridge to the future. The T-44 was developed during the final months of World War II, but arrived too late to see combat. Instead, it became a critical bridge between wartime experience and Cold War design. Featuring a lower profile, improved suspension, and better weight distribution than the T-34. It solved many battlefield problems revealed during the war. Though produced in limited numbers, the T-44 directly influenced the design of the T-54. It marked the moment when Soviet tank engineering shifted from emergency wartime solutions to long-term strategic planning. T-54 T-14, the most influential tank of the Cold War, introduced shortly after World War II, the T-54 became the foundation of Soviet armored power for decades. Armed with a powerful 100 mm gun and protected by sloped armor, it combined wartime lessons with modern engineering. Designed to fight NATO tanks across Europe, the T-54 emphasized simplicity, reliability, and mass production. It never fought in World War II, but it was shaped entirely by its lessons. With thousands produced and exported worldwide, the T-54 became one of the most influential tanks in history. T-55 T-Sun nuclear battlefield survivor. The T-55 was an improved version of the T-54, and the first tank designed with nuclear warfare in mind. Entering service in the late 1950s, it featured radiation protection, improved engine reliability, and better crew survivability. Built for a potential war in Europe, the T-55 reflected Cold War reality. Speed, numbers, and endurance mattered more than luxury. It became the most produced tank of the Cold War era and a symbol of Soviet doctrine, overwhelm the enemy through scale and persistence. Fort Twine heavy armor without a roll. The IS-4 was a heavily armored Soviet tank developed immediately after World War II, designed to counter Western heavy tanks. It featured thick armor and a powerful gun, but at a cost. Excessive weight made it slow, mechanically unreliable, and difficult to deploy. By the early Cold War, military doctrine was shifting away from slow heavy tanks toward more flexible designs. As a result, the IS-4 saw limited service and was quietly withdrawn. It was a reminder that war had changed, and heavy armor alone was no longer enough. IS-7, the ultimate heavy tank that never fought. The IS-7 was one of the most advanced heavy tanks ever built. Featuring extreme armor protection, a 130 mm gun, and advanced engineering, it represented the peak of Soviet heavy tank ambition. However, it was too heavy, too complex, and too expensive for mass production. As Cold War strategy evolved, the Soviet Union abandoned super heavy tanks altogether. The IS-7 never saw combat, but it closed the chapter on the heavy tank era, proving that the future belonged to balanced, multi-role armor. The Cold War peak technology versus the West 1960-1991, designed to fight World War I-II, autoloaders, missiles, and nuclear battlefields. T-62 Twine the first smoothbore shock. Introduced in the early 1960s, the T-62 was the world's first tank armed with a smoothbore gun, designed to defeat advanced NATO armor. Its 115 mm cannon could penetrate Western tanks at longer ranges, marking a major leap in firepower. Built for mass production and rapid deployment across Europe, the T-62 reflected Soviet doctrine: simple, rugged, and numerous. While it lacked advanced crew comfort or electronics, it served as a frontline tank throughout the Cold War and proved reliable in harsh environments. T-64 T-5, the revolutionary leap. The T-64 was one of the most radical tank designs ever fielded. Introduced secretly in the 1960s, it featured composite armor, an autoloader, and a compact profile technologies far ahead of their time. Designed to fight NATO's best tanks in a nuclear battlefield, the T-64 prioritized protection and firepower while reducing crew size. However, its complexity made it expensive and difficult to maintain. Though rarely exported, the T-64 shaped every modern Soviet and Russian tank that followed. T-72 T-Fine, the People's Cold War tank. The T-72 was developed as a simpler, cheaper alternative to the T-64, allowing the Soviet Union to equip massive armored forces quickly. Introduced in the early 1970s, it featured a 125 mm gun, autoloader, and low silhouette. Built for large-scale war in Europe, the T-72 balanced performance with mass production. It became the most widely exported Soviet tank and a symbol of Cold War armored doctrine win through numbers, speed, and endurance, rather than technical perfection. T-80 centi speed meets turbine power. The T-80 was the first production tank in the world powered by a gas turbine engine. Entering service in the late 1970s, It offered exceptional speed and acceleration designed for rapid breakthroughs against NATO defenses, optimized for high-intensity warfare in Europe. The T-80 combined advanced armor, fire control systems, and a 125mm gun. However, its turbine engine consumed massive amounts of fuel, limiting operational range. Despite this, it represented the peak of Soviet Cold War tank technology T-10. The last Soviet heavy tank, the T-10 was the final evolution of Soviet heavy tank design, developed in the shadow of World War II but serving deep into the Cold War. Armed with a powerful gun and thick armor, it was intended to smash enemy defenses. By the 1960s, military doctrine had shifted, mobility and flexibility replaced brute force. The T-10 quickly became obsolete and was phased out. Its retirement marked the end of the heavy tank era and the full transition to main battle tanks. From Soviet collapse to modern Russia, 1991 present. Survival after the USSR. The future of Russian armored T-90 holding the line after collapse. The T-90 emerged in the 1990s as Russia struggled to preserve its armored forces after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Based on the T-72 design, it combined proven reliability with modern upgrades like reactive armor and improved fire control systems. Built on a tight budget, the T-90 was designed to keep Russian tank forces relevant without expensive redesigns. Though not revolutionary, it restored confidence in Russian armor and became a major export success, keeping Russia competitive in the global tank market. T-90M Proryv modernized for 21st century war. The T-90M, known as Proryv meaning breakthrough, is the most advanced version of the T-90. Introduced in the late 2010s, it features improved armor, advanced optics, digital battlefield systems, and enhanced crew protection. Designed to counter modern Western tanks, the T-90M reflects Russia's focus on upgrading existing platforms rather than building entirely new fleets. It represents a practical approach to modern warfare, incremental improvements, combat-tested designs, and rapid deployment capability. T-14 Armata 30, a radical new direction. The T-14 Armata is Russia's most ambitious tank since the Cold War, featuring an unmanned turret, crew capsule, and advanced active protection systems. It represents a complete break from traditional Soviet design philosophy. Unveiled in 2015, the T-14 was designed to face next-generation Western armor. However, high cost and production challenges have limited deployment. The Armata signals Russia's vision for the future, but also highlights the gap between technological ambition and battlefield reality. T-72B3 Thide, upgrading the backbone. The T-72B3 is a modernized version of the Cold War-era T-72, upgraded for modern combat. Featuring improved engines, thermal sights, reactive armor, and modern communications, it transforms an old platform into a capable frontline tank. Rather than replacing thousands of older tanks, Russia chose to upgrade them. The T-72B3 reflects this strategy, cost-effective modernization over new production. It remains one of the most widely used Russian tanks today, proving adaptability can extend a tank's battlefield life by decades. 80 BVM Su-I speed returns to the battlefield. The T-80 BVM is a modernized version of the gas turbine-powered T-80, optimized for extreme environments. With upgraded armor, modern targeting systems, and improved survivability, it brings Cold War speed into modern warfare. Favored for operations in cold regions, the T-80 BVM combines mobility with updated firepower. Its return to frontline service shows Russia's willingness to revive older platforms when they still offer unique battlefield advantages, especially speed and rapid response.